Thank you for joining us today for Round 7 of the Airlift Tanker Association's virtual seminar series. Today we are joined by Lieutenant General Tom Sharpy, Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability Development, Headquarters Allied Command Transformation. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, the United States government, or the Airlift Tanker Association. Please take advantage of the question and answer feature in Teams to submit your questions anytime during the presentation. There is no need to wait until the end of the presentation portion to submit your questions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Airlift Tanker Association, General Retired Duncan McNabb.
Thank you, Popeye. Mobility teammates, welcome to Seminar 7. For those of you who may not know me, again, I'm General Duncan McNabb, former commander of AMC and Transcom, and currently am very proud to serve as the chairman of the Airlift Tanker Association. First, let me say we're in some unprecedented times, and we thank you for all you are doing every day for our nation, saving lives and giving people hope and inspiration. Please also thank your loved ones for their support of you serving the way you do. We can never thank you or them enough. The Airlift Tanker Associations continue to do all we can to support our mobility airmen, preserve our mobility culture, and strengthen our bonds. The purpose of this new virtual seminar series is to provide all of you with unique opportunities to hear from and interact directly with mobility leaders, members of industry, community leaders, and other guests of interest on topics that are important to you. Today, we are delighted to have Lieutenant General Tom Sharpy, Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability Development, Headquarters Allied Command Transformation, Norfolk, Virginia. He is at the leading edge of the transformation of NATO to be ready to deal with an uncertain and challenging future. Our new National Defense Strategy completely changed the focus of our strategy to strategic peer competition, and NATO strategy is following suit. Tom is one of our most outstanding mobility leaders. He was formerly our Deputy Commander of AMC and has always been a huge supporter of ATA. Besides his time in command, he was also aide to the Vice President, served a couple of tours as A8 in Europe and at AMC, and interesting enough, also led the Colonels Group, which is in charge of all the Colonels assignments, and then the General Officers Group that took care of all the General Officer assignments. And so I'm very afraid of him. So he knows too much about all of us, but one of those folks that I admire tremendously and is a true friend, not only to me, but to many of you, and certainly to the mobility world. So Tom, over to you. Again, great to have you here, and we really appreciate your time.
No, hey, General McNabb, thank you. I have a lot of mentors in the Air Force, professionally and personally, who have impacted me profoundly throughout the years, and the example that you and Linda set, not only as leaders, but also personally as family members, is right up there at the top of those who I aspire to try and emulate. So thank you for that. Thank you for the kind introduction. And Popeye, thanks for the disclaimer, because I was a little nervous talking about NATO. It is my honor to be here today and to give you a little glimpse of this organization that I serve, and then try and tie it back into the similarities between the relationships with the member nations and the relationships between Air Mobility Command and the relationships with the ATA organization. First of all, I must say that I think I've gained more from my relationship with ATA than ATA has gained from me. I'm a former previous Golden Bear chapter president and have benefited from the relationships, the mentoring, and the professional development that this organization has influenced me in my life and my career throughout the many years. And so I am honored to be here today. As General McNabb said, it is a changing world doing it virtually. For some of the millennials out there, it's easy, but for some of us, we continue to learn every day. And I'm excited to talk to you today, to talk a little bit about what I do. Hopefully I won't put most of you to sleep, and I look forward to the questions and answers. The first slide that we have here, why, where do you fly and why? As you can imagine, the shaded area that you see here, if you can, is the NATO 30 member nations. And you know, you might not know it, but just about, you know, the majority of your flying time that goes through Europe or down to the AOR, you're in European NATO airspace. And it's important to realize, how do you get there and how do you do it? How do you get access to not only the airspace, but the bases, the APODs that you land at, and the throughput that you get? You get that because of the alliance. And you get that because of the partnership and relationship that we have with those NATO member nations. Nothing happens in Europe, and I would say even in parts beyond Europe, without the access to the critical infrastructure, to the bases and the airspace that NATO affords us. You might not know it, you might not believe it, but when you're in there, you are a part of NATO, because as I said, the 30 member nations, the US is a proud member, and they're part of just about everything that we do. About relationships and partnerships. The most successful alliance in the history of the world is NATO. Celebrated 70 years last year. Just like we celebrate the relationships between Air Mobility Command and the Airlift Tanker Association. We built our relationships, and we talk about how important they are, and we talk about that active, joint, total force, allies, coalition partners, and industry, all a part of our relationships. And I think that ATA does a phenomenal job of ensuring that we nurture those relationships. Each and every one of us plays a role in those relationships, and they all impact not only what we do for ATA, what we do for our organizations, Air Mobility Command, the United States, the Department of Defense, and NATO at writ large. And so I appreciate the similarities in the relationships, the global organization that ATA has become. You bring together the global mobility air forces together in a forum that talks about the importance of not just the aviators, the maintainers, the supporters, the service providers, and our industry partners. We're in it together, just like any key relationship, and none of us can do it alone, and certainly none of us would succeed by ourselves. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an education today on NATO. When I was Captain Sharpy, sitting back at my first ATA back in Washington, D.C., General McNabb, that goes back a while, with General Fogelman as the chief, we recognized then that I didn't know much about NATO. And I will tell you, even Major General Sharpy, sitting at the hallowed halls of Scott Air Force Base, didn't know much about NATO. And I really think that today I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a glimpse of what it is. So next slide. So what you might not realize is that NATO not only enables your mission, but it's probably one of our most important coalition organizations in the globe. And NATO itself is out doing many of the same missions of Air Mobility Command and our ATA partners. If you look here, you see the NATO AWACS, you see the multi-role transport tanker, and you see the mighty C-17 from the Strategic Airlift Consortium, mandated by 12 of our nations, 2 Partnership for Peace nations out of Papa, Hungary. They do many of the exact same missions that we do. They provide supplies to those in need. They provide booms to those in the air that enable our strategic reach, and they expand our mobility capabilities exponentially with additional air crews, maintainers, and aerial porters, all supporting the mobility mission globally. But they have similar values, and they safeguard the freedoms and to secure the political and military ambitions that our nations have set. We don't think about it enough, and we certainly don't talk about it enough. What would the world look like without NATO? What would the world look like without relationships? What would the world look like without partners and coalition allies who are willing to help us enable the fight? And I will tell you this, it's my humble opinion that the United States of America needs NATO as much or more than they need us. Because think for a moment, all of you fly through European airspace, what global reach would look like if we didn't have access to the continent of Europe. Next slide. So as I said, it's the 70th anniversary of NATO last year, the most successful alliance, in my opinion, in the history of the world. But it's a political and military organization. I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about that. When I got here, I didn't understand the importance of that. I would also say that's also an industrial alliance. But this slide depicts the two sides of the equation, the political and the military. The political side reduces the risk of conflict because it builds cooperation and it provides a collective defense for the 30 member nations. The military side provides the military might that is needed when deterrence fails. And if a declaration of the treaty is ever exercised, we have to be able to provide a decisive military force to be able to win, which enables the collective defense and the deterrence that the political side worries so much about. And as you see, we are 30 member nations. We assessed our most recent member, North Macedonia, on 1 April. And we continue to look for other nations to bring into our coalition. The political side, you can see on the left-hand side, our Secretary General is Jan Stoltenberg from the great country of Norway. And he runs the Ambassador Assembly, which is the NAC, of all 30 member nations. And each of those countries has a delegation. So in the United States, we have Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson from the great state of Texas. And she has a mission of the United States with political entities and military entities that serve her in her role as a NATO ambassador for the United States. And each of those has many committees and assistant secretary generals that are depicted on the left-hand side. That's the political side of the equation. On the right-hand side, you have the military side. They exist to provide our best military advice to the NAC and to the political side. As you can see, it is run by the chairman of the military committee, Air Sir Stuart Peach, who was also the previous United Kingdom's chairman of defense. And then we also have the deputy chairman that runs the international military staff that complements the political side by Lieutenant General Hans Werner from the great country of Germany. And then also Sir Stuart Peach's deputy chairman of the military committee is Scott Kinsvider, another fellow lieutenant general from the United States Air Force. And we have a military representative for the United States, which is a Marine Corps Lieutenant General John Love. On the bottom right-hand corner are the two strategic commands that I want to talk a little bit more about today. You have Allied Command Operations and you have Allied Command Transformation. Now, most are familiar with Allied Command Operations, and we'll talk a little bit more in the following slides about that, commanded by General Todd Walters, who is the former USAFE Africa commander, and then my boss, General Andre Lanata, who was the former French air chief. So next slide. So a little bit about NATO. I talked about Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which it talks about an attack on one is an attack on all. And then in 2000, that was done during the Washington Treaty some 70 plus years ago, and the right to self-defense. But also there was an amendment in 2002 which brought into the terrorism fight. And so what that means is that's the strength of the alliance, because if a potential adversary is thinking of doing something with one of the member nations, that means that all member nations would come to their defense. That's the collective defense, and that is why it is such a deterrent to not mess with NATO, because if you mess with one, you're going to have to pick a fight with all 30. And that's really the strength of that alliance. Next slide. And oh, by the way, the Washington Treaty has been invoked one time in the history of NATO, and that was after 9/11. Unanimously, without even asking, the nations took a vote and declared it as invoked the Washington Treaty. That the attack on the World Trade Centers was an attack on, and the United States was an attack on NATO. And therefore, we've continued to provide continuous support to our NATO mission in Iraq and Afghanistan ever since that day. And so again, I believe we need NATO as much or more than NATO needs us. Let me talk about this consensus here a little bit, because it's interesting. You know, unlike in a democratic process where you might control 51% of the vote, consensus means that everyone has to agree. And it's not always about saying yes, but it's about no one saying no. And so the term silence equals consent means you might not agree, but unless you feel strongly and don't say no, it passes. And so, you know, if you have 29 members that agree and you're that one nation, you don't want to say no. And that's called breaking silence. If you say no, then that means all of the other members that agree are going to try and get you to yes. So it's the power of no, and if you don't say no, that means yes. And compromise and consensus mean that it's a lot of quid pro quo. In order to get something, you may have to give something. And so my words, I say that NATO is about not getting what you want, but it's about getting what you need. And that's that trade space between what you want and what you need. And words matter. This consensus is done in every committee meeting that goes on. And so I spent a lot of time working the room and working the crowd of my military committee members, making sure that there are no surprises when I go and brief them when I try and get a decision. So the art of compromise is something, and the patience that NATO takes, I've learned well. I think I'd be a much better parent after this experience. So next slide. Let's talk a little bit about NATO headquarters. I said you're familiar with Allied Command operations, but there's more to that than meets the eye. In fact, interesting fact, I was getting a haircut on the base at the Naval Support Annex in Norfolk about 2 weeks ago, and the barber said, "Air Force guy, what are you doing here?" He did not know that we had our NATO headquarters on the same base that he lived. And I would say many of you didn't recognize the fact that there's a NATO headquarters here in the United States down here in Norfolk, Virginia. And that's the Allied Command transformation. So as I said, you're familiar with ACO and Supreme Allied Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, which is SHAPE in Mons, Belgium, commanded by General Walters. He's also dual-hatted as the EUCOM commander and SAC Europe. And he has 3 other 4-stars that help him run that amazing organization. It's a pretty dynamic organization out of Mons, Belgium. Their focus is on operational warfighting and commanding of the NATO forces if there ever was a declaration. And they conduct military operations, and they define the future requirements that the warfighter needs in order to be successful. On the other hand, Allied Command Transformation here in Norfolk, Virginia, the only NATO headquarters in the United States, we're responsible to transform and improve NATO's military effectiveness throughout the training, policy, doctrine development, capability development, innovation, and we provide the tools to meet the warfighter needs here in Norfolk, Virginia. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But a little trivia, General Mattis was the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation from 2007 to 2009. And Allied Command Transformations, where I have the opportunity to do my due diligence on a daily basis. And with COVID, I get to spend a lot more time here versus overseas in Europe, where I used to spend the majority of my time. So let's go a little bit to talk about what I do in capability development, because I know that's riveting you to your seats. So next slide. So I'm also, as I said, General McNabb tried to get my duty title right. It's a mouthful, but I'm also the senior U.S. service rep in Allied Command Transformation. And that is a pretty daunting task, especially trying to sift through the policies on behalf of the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, and the Space Force to ensure that we are giving guidance in support of all of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that work here. And then also trying to make sure that I meet the member nations of the 30 nations and their caveats. So this is a snapshot of what I do in my responsibilities. I am blessed to have the opportunity to work for 3 1-stars that you, 3 1-stars and a 2-star that you see here. Reverend Renee Tass from the Netherlands Army, Brigadier General Paul Brimdahl from Denmark Army, Brigadier General Dag Amath from the Norwegian Air Force, and I have Dieter Kohl, a 1-star from the German Army, who is my innovation champion. It's pretty awesome, the things that we do. And on this slide, you see all of those capabilities that we are trying to not only sustain and maintain, but then also replace when the warfighter has future needs. And some of those are pretty daunting. Look at things like under that is space, air command and control, land command and control, facilities for maritime, land, and air. There's a pretty amazing level of responsibility that we do on a daily basis. And we're always developing the interoperability, the standards, the analysis of alternatives, providing traceability back to that requirement, and quality assurance to ensure that across the .mil PFI spectrum, that we provide the warfighter the tools that they need and ensure that they all can work not only from the national perspective, but from the NATO perspective. And I got to tell you, it's pretty hard work, and I'm blessed to have an amazing team that does that. And in order to ensure that we meet the needs of the warfighter going forward, we have an innovation hub that's located in a partnership with Old Dominion University. That's where we connect with academia and industry. Think of NATO's Spark or your Spark Tank and AFWorks. That's what we do with our innovation hub, soon to be a lab here at Old Dominion. And we base our innovation efforts based on Castle Run. We have the operators and the coders together trying to write the code and software to meet the needs of the warfighter. And we've done some pretty amazing things in the short time that we've stood that up and focused on the Castle Run model over the last 12 months. More than 30 programs at any one time. Cradle to grave support from idea to concept, focusing on accelerating that capability delivery. When I got here, the average time was 16.4 years. I'm working to get that down to the single digits faster, as General McNabb, remember from his programming days. You know, the acquisition strategies and the ability to deliver keeps me awake at night. But we are doing it. We're using innovation, and we're trying to deliver things. You know, my words, if we don't change that methodology, we're going to be delivering yesterday's technology tomorrow. And my goal is to deliver the capabilities in the hands of the warfighters before they need them. And as you can see, it's a pretty daunting task. As I said, we're tied closely with AFWorks and Castle Run, and I'm sure I'll have any questions that you have on answering that as we go forward. But a pretty daunting portfolio of a team of over 650 people here in Norfolk, Virginia, to do that. Next slide. So this is, you know, this is where I want to talk about what the map has taught me. I've had the opportunity to fly many of the weapon systems in Air Mobility Command. I've got to fly the mighty 135A model, the R model, the C5A and B, the M. I've got to fly the C-17, and there's a picture in here where I got to deliver a KC-46. And I've gotten to serve under many great leaders. I've got to be deployed doing many joint operations, not only in Vincenza supporting the Libyan operation, but some of the pictures here in Puerto Rico helping to rebuild after the devastation of the Category 5 hurricane. But one of the stories I want to share with you is when I was Captain Sharpy at my first Airlift Tanker Association convention. I had the honor to sit and meet someone who I didn't know who he was, but he was a seasoned mobility warrior. And when I asked him what he did, he said, "I commanded MATs and I flew the hump." And I even pronounced his name wrong. I called him General Charlton. But I soon realized that man that I was talking to and got to chat with over the days, they gave out the General P.K. Carlton Award for Valor at the ATA capstone dinner the following night. And I realized right then and there that I was with a father of our mobility, a legend of our command, and I didn't even know who he was. And I realized that this ATA woke me up and realized that if I'm going to be a member of a professional organization, I need to learn a little bit about it. And there's no better forum to do that than the ATA and the people that you get to meet and you get to associate with, because there are legends of mobility and they're a part of this organization. And I was nascent in my duties to be a professional. And from that day forward, it was a game changer to me to realize that I needed to know a little bit about the history of the organization, the heroes that came before me, and I did it through my association with the Airlift Tanker Association. And I am thankful that ATA woke me up and made me realize that I could do that at a convention, I could do that through seminars like this, and I could do it through reading the history of the great command that I was a part of. And again, so it's important to you, those young and up and comers, if you want to be somebody, you're going to ask me, how can you be a professional airman? How can you be a professional military airman? It's getting to know the leaders of your organization. It's getting to know the forefathers of our command and the pioneers of those who came before us. And there's no better way to do that than being associated with the Airlift Tanker Association. And it's about those relationships that I kindled as a captain, and those relationships that I have had, including General McNabb sitting here, were relationships that I used throughout my career. The captains that I had solved problems with over beverages at the ATA were the same lieutenant colonels that I used when I was in squadron command. They were the same colonels what I used to help me solve hard problems when I was a wing commander. when I was at a NAF, when I was at Air Mobility Command. Those relationships mattered, and I used them to help make sure that I wasn't off the reservation, and that I used the insight of those relationships that I cultivated as a young captain. And I encourage you to do those same things, because many of them might not be in uniform, but if I get a tough problem, as General McNabb is known, I reach out to those mentors and friends and use their insights to help make sure that I get the right answer. Okay, I think you can kill the slides. Bottom line, I want to share an African proverb. If we want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I've talked a lot about relationships, and Admiral Stavridis, he used to say that we are stronger together. And I believe that our mobility forces, our ATA, our nation, and this alliance is stronger together. NATO has taught me the value of those relationships. It's also taught me the value of patience. And I realize that if we want to go farther, we got to go together. Our adversaries don't have the same consensus building that we do in NATO. They're an autocrat. They can make a decision and move out. So we have two choices in front of us. We can either go slow or we can go fast. We can either go alone or we can go together. And in NATO, I choose to go together. So hopefully you learn a little bit. Hopefully you're not banging your head on your screen, you didn't fall asleep. General McNabb, sir, I'll turn it back over to you and Popeye for any questions that you want to throw my way.
All right, General Sharpy, thank you so much. And clearly no one's falling asleep because the question line is lighting up. So we're going to start with a first question. It's as a senior military aide to the Vice President during 9/11, how did your experience, particularly in the PIOC, shape your future?
Well, I think that it goes back before that day. I think and it's really relevant for us as in the profession of arms that we're in. Prior to 9/11, I couldn't have told you whether I was ready or not. But I went back at 9/11. I thought back to the training that I had, the scenarios we had gone through, the many training sessions and drills we went through, and I was ready. And 9/11, believe it or not, it was as crazy and chaotic was. The machine worked exceptionally well because of the training that we had in place. And it's the same applies for our young airmen out there as they go into combat. Those when I was an instructor, if you train right, combat is easy. And my goal when I was an instructor was to say, combat was easy because I flew with Sharpy. 9/11, well, we were prepared because we had prepared for not that day, but we had prepared for scenarios like that day. And the fact that we had a well-oiled machine, and I think that the nation benefited from the training that we had endured to be successful when it happened. And I think all of us, as we reflect on our careers, you go back and you look at moments of significance, you relied on the training that got you there, and the training that got me there was tested and validated on that day. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it absolutely answers the question. Now we're going to move on to another question from Bob Fowler. How is NATO working to increase their air refueling role? And do you think the potential commercial air refueling effort will help support their efforts?
Hey, Bobby, thanks for the question. I think that we have a deficit in air refueling within NATO. I think that we are trying to capitalize on some of the tools that we developed within the Air Force. And I know you know what I'm talking about, Bobby. Jigsaw, and we're trying to, first of all, figure out how we can be more efficiently and effectively use the resources that we have. And that's the current venue that I'm working with General Harigian at AirCom right now, and deliver that quickly with our partners in SAF-IA. As far as capacity goes, if there are commercial assets that are available that we can use in the NATO environment, either for training or operationally, we are all ears, and I look forward to furthering that conversation in a separate venue, Bobby, if we can do that. And I'm aware of what's going on, but I don't have the specificity, and I'll talk to General Harigian on what exactly AirCom is doing to increase that capacity. But if there are options, I'm always willing to hear. Over.
All right, sir. Next one's coming from Dave Merrill. Do you think the NATO Innovation Hub is leading or following the U.S. Air Force in conducting advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning activities like Kessel Run?
Hey, Dave, good to see you again. Good to hear from you again. I think you know the answer. We are trying to lead, but I would say that we're probably on the wing. I'm not sure that we're leading anything. That's our goal. You know, General Andre Lanata, my boss, he is committed to using innovation to lead the alliance, but I don't think that we are leading many of the efforts that are ongoing in the U.S. Consensus is harder and it slows things down, but we are trying to replicate the successes of SBIR, many of the initiatives that the U.S. is undertaking, and applying those techniques, tactics, and procedures into our innovation hub and lab to try and replicate those. You know, the good news is we don't have the FARs. The bad news is I have to get 30 people to approve anything. And so we're trying to do that, not as fast as I would like, but I'm pretty amazed at some of the things we've been able to deliver in a short time frame. But I would say that we're not leading, but my goal is to lead. Over.
All right, the next one is coming in as an anonymous, but describe the efforts and impacts of the current U.S. changes to our NATO force posture and what you're hearing about that from our allies.
Yeah, that's an easy one. So I had a little bit of experience with this back in 2012 to 14 when we did the European Infrastructure Consolidation Commission, when there was an appetite to reduce the infrastructure in Europe prior to looking at any closure of bases in the United States. I think this is a similar effort to try and consolidate and reduce cost in the footprint in Europe. As a recovering programmer, I would say that a plan is one thing, but until it is resourced and you get approval, it's another thing. And we had a lot of efforts back in 2014 that were on the books, but yet didn't happen. And so I'm not going to go against what we're trying to do. I will just wait and see until it actually happens versus what the plans are today. I think that from a European perspective, it seemed to have been supportive. Some of the nations aren't as supportive as others, obviously. But as long as we do the following and ensure our partners that we will be there to support them in a crisis or declaration, then I think our European partners from a NATO perspective are supportive of that. But we got to prove that, and the plans, as we execute those plans and go forward in those plans, more details will come out because a lot of them were pretty generic. But the proof is in the pudding, what's going to happen and what we can approve and what we actually execute versus the plan that was unleashed at the Pentagon a couple weeks ago. Over.
All right, copy all that, sir. Thanks again for the insight here. Got one from Daryl Burke. Can you briefly, this is a funny one, can you briefly talk a little bit about Joint Multi-Domain C2? As an organization, what is the way ahead for the Alliance? E3 replacement. As the U.S. conducts its ABMS 120-day demonstrations, is NATO participating?
Thanks, Daryl. That's three is where I count them. It's three questions. But anyway, I'll try and answer the best I can, Daryl. The first one, we are witting and trying to follow as best we can the ABMS journey that the Air Force and DoD is on. The challenge with some of that is getting a REL NATO version, trying to do that. So I have some U.S. airmen that are following it, but then trying to get a REL NATO version because, as we all know, we're not going to fight probably by ourselves as a single service. Probably do it as a joint service with coalition partners, and the alliance needs to be a part of that. From an air command and control perspective, I'm leading the study on air command and control, the ACTS program that's been around for a couple decades. I'm delivering a report to the military committee by the 30th of October, where we've analyzed not only the current program, but all the national systems that were nominated and trying to figure out what works best and how to plug it in. I think the future realistic question is, what does that architecture look like? And I think that's where the journey that you're talking about with ABMS and the architecture is vitally important, because I believe, if we can do it in a single domain first, which NATO struggles, then we can do multi-domain and then eventually to all domain. but we got to be able to do it in a single domain first, and we're struggling to do that now. The concept of that architecture is really something we are trying to do. You mentioned AWACS replacement. It's called AFSC, and that's the program where we are looking at the capability that we need from a systems of systems open architecture. So it's not a platform as an AWACS, but it would be a combination of platforms that come together to provide that system of systems architecture so that you can share data amongst platforms and be able to provide that common operational picture to the warfighter so that they can make decisions real time in a NATO to inform the political masters so that they can give the authorities to the commander to be able to execute. And so all those are related questions, and we are trying to do that, and we're cognizant, but it'd be very helpful if we could get that REL NATO version from our partners to be able to keep that journey going. Hopefully that answers the questions if I remembered them correctly. Over.
I think you got them all, sir. The next one's from Eric McCroskey. He says, hello, and then can you speak to NATO concerns about the cyber threat, both to the overall mission and to the air mobility mission?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the NATO threat first. You know, cyber is something that, you know, I worry about every day. You know, we have no news to anybody on this net. We have potential adversaries or even people that we don't even know who it is trying to get into our networks every single day. And we are working to robust those capabilities from NATO perspective. The SIOC initiative that we have in NATO, the Cyber Operations Center that has stood up last year is really making a difference. And we're learning from, you know, some of our member nations that are further down the field when it comes to cyber. I have an amazing team here. It was small and it's growing. And we are doing the strategy and the vision for cyber as a domain. We've declared that about 2 years ago. And this is where the size of the nation doesn't matter, because I have one of the greatest cyber professionals in my organization, and he's from Estonia. And the fact that they've struggled through a cyber attack and brought their nation down, we have learned from them, and we are applying some of those lessons learned into the NATO vernacular. And I think in some of the areas, as I talked to, you know, General Schwado on the J6, we actually have some things that we are doing that are probably ahead of where some of the other member nations, including the United States, are doing. And we're working to share that information with them in order to trade some of the things that they're doing in AVMS and some of the other initiatives. But without cyber, you know, you can't do distributed operation. And I would say just with this COVID virus, we have all tried to do distributed work, distributed operations. And if we don't have a robust cyber footprint, we can't defend the networks, then nothing's going to work. And so we are working on that every day and trying to make it better, stronger, cheaper, faster. But we're not there yet. Over.
Copy that. We're definitely concerned about that with these virtual seminar series too. A lot of things are all relying on the cyber domain right now. The next question is from Shalena, and she wants to know, what role do civilians play in the NATO mission?
Yeah, hey Shalena, thank you. You know, our civilian partners are huge. You know, the staff that I have here is not only of the 30, we have 25 member nations here in this headquarters, but I have contractors and I have NATO civilian employees. And I would tell you that many of the programs that I worked that you saw, the 30 programs, some of those are decades or multi-decades long. The civilian continuity that the civilians bring to the table is incredibly important. And I would say it's vitally important because our military members, we get them from our nations and they send us great talent, but they're here for a 3-year tour. Our civilians are here for longer and they provide that continuity, that stability. And I will tell you, they provide the brain trust that we need, because there's many times I say, hey, how about this? And I get that, well, so we've already tried that back 5-10 years ago. And so they're critically important as they are in Air Mobility Command, as they are in industry there, but they're the foundation of the bedrock of the continuity that we need in order to ensure the continuity of operations that NATO must depend on a daily and long-term basis.
Thanks for that, sir. I'm going to combine two questions on you here. We have one from Nate Allerhagen, and then we have an anonymous, but they're wanting to know what improvements in aircraft cargo and air refueling sharing have happened in across NATO, and talk a little bit about NATO's reliance on the U.S. for those capabilities. Yeah,
so NATO, just like in tankers, right? They probably don't have enough lift to meet their demands and their needs. The COVID crisis, when we initially needed to move supplies around Europe, we depended on the United States to do that because at the time we just didn't have enough capacity to do that. The United States clearly has more strategic lift than just about anybody in the world, and I would say that Europe is at a deficit for that. Tactically, they have some great platforms, but strategically, they're lacking, and the ability of the EPCC to log into that network to be able to leverage those capabilities, either through the HAW or other organizations is vitally important. But I'm not going to kid you, the United States is probably, the biggest on the block, and we need their support. And it was highlighted during initial throes of trying to get things through this COVID crisis out to the member nations. And if you think about it, if there's going to be a tip-fit flow, and either from a UCOM perspective or a SACEUR perspective, we can't do it without the significant lift, not only of the mobility forces, but also the sea lift forces. When you have that two continent between, North America and Europe, you can't do it without mobility. And the U.S. has I would say, a great capability that we try and use on a daily basis, and we need it when it comes to contingency even more so than the past. And Nate, no more questions. Those are too hard. Over.
I don't think there's a hard question out there for you quite yet, sir. But I got one that relates to that. So the question is, why does NATO still rely on the SALIS agreement using foreign and 124s, and what type of mission are those aircraft flying for NATO?
This is where I'll tap dance a little bit. I'm not as familiar with the agreement as I used to be, but I can look into it. But I will tell you that NATO looks at the biggest bang for their buck, and if they can get capabilities, as long as it doesn't induce risk into the system, they will try and get the biggest bang for their buck. And if they can use SALIS and other competitors to provide lift, as long as it doesn't provide a security risk, I'll leave that one for later. They will use it. Over.
All right, Mark Dillons wanted to thank you for a great brief, and then he follows up with, while some tend to focus on potential reductions or drawdowns in Europe, NATO, can you talk a little bit about our growing relationship with Poland and other NATO nations?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. I think that, the geography matters, right? And when you look at our member nations, and you look at the accessions of, in the last probably 10 years that we've done with NATO member nations, there's some key terrain that we've brought into the alliance. And if you just look at the reach that you can, the location of some of those allies, the geography has changed and it has shifted, and it matters. It's a global alliance. It used to be more regional in its nature, because what happens in the South China Sea impacts Europe. What happens in Europe impacts South China Sea. And so, trying to figure out where is the right basing strategy, where are the right nodes, where are the right APODs and SPODs to not only engage and secure Europe, but then to sustain Europe if attack happens from other locations. We're always trying to figure out where is the best place to operate and to maintain and to keep our forces, and what SOFAs we can write to ensure the protection of that access and the quality of life for our airmen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines when they live within those locations. So I know that's kind of a non-answer, but it's continually evolving, and the latest announcements shows that we probably don't have it right. Over.
All right, I think you're reading our audience's mind, because the next question is from Robert Van Hoos, and he's asking, with rising concerns with China, what challenges does that potentially present for you, and do you find yourself working with other Pacific countries?
So I'll use cyber as an example. We do CWIX, which is a cyber exercise that we do on an annual, twice a year. And so we were about to do a cyber coalition exercise where we had partners from Australia, Japan, and New Zealand that were going to come be a part of the exercise. Obviously, with COVID, it didn't happen, but we realized that it's not just Europe that we worry about. We worry about our partners that are a part of this alliance that are beyond just the member nations, and we got to make sure that we learn from what they have learned living in a different region, because the global focus of NATO, I'd say the global focus of all of us, right? I mean, look at what happened. a small province in China has brought the world to its knees. And so we have to learn from those nations that are closer to our potential adversaries and be ready for what they are learning and what we can do from their experiences, what lessons they have learned, so that we can adapt our TTPs, learn from what capabilities they think we need to have, and then adapt them into our toolkit so that when we need them, we have them. Over. Thanks, Robert.
All right, sir, we're going to go to a little bit lighter question at this point. Do you miss CRUD at ATA and other events? And why do you think that this generation of airmen is not as interested in CRUD as, let's say, you and I were?
Yeah, I could guess who probably asked that question, because he's the CRUD master himself. I would say that, I think that my generation, I guess I'll say the old people in the room, we looked at events like that where we bonded with each other, and that social interaction was important. Today, 2 years ago, we wouldn't have thought of doing a seminar like this. The world has changed, and the way that people communicate has changed. For me, going to the club, having a CRUD game and being with the officers and having a conversation, that's how I learn. Today they do it differently. Out there they can do 5 things at once. I struggle to do 1 thing at a time. And playing CRUD and having a beverage and having a conversation maxed me out. Nowadays, I know that there are people on this net that are probably doing 8 things at once. They have the capacity to do that. My brain doesn't work that way. Social relationships and social interaction and having those one-on-one conversations, I think, was vitally important for me. It doesn't mean that the current generation can't do 8 things. I just can't. And CRUD was a way that, you learned how strong the other adversaries were going to be.
And you learned how to take advantage of what you had and they didn't, and vice versa. So I agree with you. I learned as much around the CRUD table as I did at most PME events. So the next one's going to be slightly harder. Can you give some insight into POTUS's 2% expectation on NATO allies, and talk a little bit about the barriers for some of the countries in getting there?
Yeah, so, show me a good account and I'll show you a good balance sheet. So how do you interpret the 2%, right? If they provide forces or they provide things that aren't a part of that 2%, the math kind of gets fuzzy. Let me tell you what I'm concerned more about. I'm concerned more about, because that percentage is based on GDP. I'm concerned about the impact that COVID has globally on the GDPs of the member nations. I still try and read on occasion, and some of the documents that I've read, there's going to be anywhere from a 10 to 27% decrease in GDPs due to the COVID crisis. My concern is, what do we do when that GDP and the percentage and the overall commitment to the alliance goes down? What do we stop doing, or how do we, I was a programmer during sequestration. I believe that this could be, from a perspective back to the 2008 days, this could be that all over again. And so I just don't know how we're going to continue to do some of the things we need to do, because in my world, I try and get the nations to invest in the future capabilities. And when you decrease budgets, those are sometimes some of the first things that go. And we can't afford to do that, because in the past, we were in a relative calm in Europe, but the world has shown that we have adversaries, potential adversaries, that our near peers are growing, and they are investing unprecedented in capabilities that we may or may not have that edge anymore, and it's eroding. And so therefore, we got to figure out how we're going to invest in those capabilities that we must have in the future. And if we stop working on them, then that gap between that edge that we used to have and that our adversaries could have is something that none of us want to live through. Over.
All right, sir, I think this is going to be our last question for the day, but what challenges do the different capabilities and systems of each nation pose for the ability of the alliance to come together in a conflict? Is NATO working on ways to improve interoperability between the wide range of capabilities?
Yeah, so I talked about CWIX. That's just one of the exercises. FMN, Foreign Mission Networking, where we put the standards out there for the nations to meet, and we continue to spiral that. to be more effective. You know, it's really, we communicate to the nation so that we do interoperability by design. When I look at any requirement and capability, when I do the acquisition strategy, I ensure that we meet or exceed those standards that are set by the STANADS agency, because without interoperability, having a great capability, even if it's the greatest capability in the world, if we can't interoperate and use it amongst the partners in the 30 nations, then it doesn't work. And so we must, and we have to do interoperability by design. And so at the beginning of our requirements journey, as we turn that into a capability, we make sure that interoperability is at the beginning, it's at the middle, and it's at the end. And we test it and validate that to ensure that we have that. Now, I will tell you that in my innovation hat, that's going to be it's very challenging, because innovation means you're doing things that don't exist. And then sometimes that means that, you know, I don't want to slow down the innovation efforts of those nations, but I still try and make sure that it's got to be part of the NATO effort. So it's got to be interoperable. And we try to do that, but, you know, it's a journey and we're not there yet. Over.
All right, sir, you've been concise enough. I'm throwing one more in for you for the last question. Is, can you tell us a story about an airman that impacted you?
There's a lot of them. Let me tell you one. I won't go into specifics, but let's just say I had an airman that was struggling with the fitness part of the equation. We didn't allow that airman to go to a PME that was essential for that person to get promoted. But instead of quitting, that airman revamped their lifestyle. That airman took it as a personal journey to start walking, start jogging, start running, and did more every day. In fact, I got to do it with that airman on a regular basis. We met once a week, and I saw the improvement in that airman. And that airman not only passed the PT test, but became a physical fitness leader and got promoted and did amazing things as a leader. But it started with the problem, and that airman taught me about resilience, taught me about overcoming adversity, and taught me what it is to be an airman and how it is to not only lead yourself, but then be an example for many others. And that airman, and that story that I only gave you part of it, inspires me every single time when I have something hard. I don't stop and I don't quit. We will not falter and we will not fail, and that airman did not. And that airman motivates me every single day, and that airman probably doesn't even know it. But that's an airman, and I have, you know, there's two of those exact examples that were very similar, but I have hundreds of them, because any success I've had in the United States Air Force has been because the airmen have made it possible. My job as a leader was to lead and encourage, to coach and mentor, and to listen, because they will always give you the answer. And if you're not listening, they might only tell you once. And if you don't listen the first time, they're probably not going to tell you again. But if you do listen, you'll be amazed with the results, because they always have the answers. Over.
Sir, I can't think of a more appropriate message in these times of COVID for perseverance and fighting and going on. So thank you so much. I'll give it to you for some closing remarks before I pass it back off to General McNabb.
No, hey, thanks, as General McNabb said, thanks for what you do every single day. And that's not only to our airmen, but to our civilians, our total force members, and more importantly, our industry partners. From a NATO perspective, I recognize that I need industry partners better, more, faster. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that, and we're working on it. To those out there that are flying the line, God bless you and thank you. You know, work really hard. Use hangar fly sessions, use the mentoring sessions to know your craft. Be a professional airman. Know your limits before you get into the cockpit, and that happens by talking to people and learning from mentors out there, and learning what it is you can and can't do, and knowing your limits before you get into a situation where they're tested. I learned a long time ago from a wise mentor who said, good pilots never challenge themselves, because they have their limits set and they make decisions to limit their skills that they have to test. And so do well. We're all counting on you. Don't screw it up. Over. And oh, by the way, hopefully 2 of the young Lieutenant Sharpies are out there listening, and I'm talking to you. Don't screw it up. Over.
Hey, Sharps, what a great rundown and inspiring words. I tell you what, I'm ready to sign up. I'm not sure I can handle NATO. It's a little too complicated for me, but other than that, I'm good. You know, it's but a great rundown on what NATO is doing and their ongoing transformation to meet the threats that are real, really huge out there. We're very lucky to have you where you are, and just hearing from you is just outstanding. And also thanks much for talking about the value ATA brings to our mobility warriors, especially on our members' professional development and the lifetime relationships that in many cases started standing around after we've listened to somebody speak about what we're doing, and then we would then talk about it. And as you say, have a beverage or two and enjoy that conversation as those goes on for 20 or 30 years. I think about the many conversations you and I've had about this over the years, and which included how we can make it even more valuable for our mobility warriors. And this seminar series is an example of that. So again, thank you for being a part of this. Our next seminar is scheduled for 11 September 2020, where a couple of our young leaders in the TACC will talk about TACC's Mattermost, the new command and control connectivity with our mobility warriors in the field. Really trying to figure out can you do things in a way that whether it's secure or whether it's we have to be in the open, it allows us to be able to communicate quicker and not have to worry about that in a way that allows you all to have a much better picture and much more rapid response. These are exciting times, and this promises to be a great leap forward for command and control. And having commanded the TACC and also been on the line many times when I couldn't get through or I had to talk secure and had to wait till the next time I got to a place where I could get to a secure net, it isn't exactly as nimble as we need to be against the threats we face. I also want to remind you of our upcoming ATA virtual convention on 27 to 29 October. That's really coming together. It will be an outstanding 3 days. A real highlight will be hearing directly from our new Chief of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, and our new commander of AMC, General Jackie Van Ovost. We also, a couple of our new senior enlisted leaders, we've reached out to them to make sure they know we would sure like them to join us as well. We also have some great seminars lined up that will be really well worth your time. And for industry partners, we'll do another full industry interface day between AMC and you all, which will allow a link up directly with AMC and Air Force leadership with our great industry partners. We will also have a virtual convention floor, which will allow everybody to kind of go into each of the exhibits that the industry partners bring, and be able to begin to think about how they're going to help us meet the requirements we have to meet the new National Defense Strategy. So with that, please tell your friends and coworkers about this series. Thank you, Sharps, and thank you, Popeye, and the ATA team for putting this all together. All the best, and stay safe. We need you out there. So take care, and out here.
Great, General Sharpy. There were 4 people that wanted to say their thanks. Danny Smith, Tony Robertson, Killer, and Vicky all say thank you for a thoughtful and candid talk. With that, we will go ahead and finish up. Thank you for joining us today. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, the United States government, or the Airlift Tanker Association. Please send comments and suggestions for future topics and guests to us at admin@airlifttanker.onmicrosoft.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.